Hi everyone. So in this video we are going to look at alignment, and I'm following the pivot point and the group videos with an alignment video because it's a great way to kind of summarize some of the things that we've practiced. Because when we are aligning things, we're always going to be using points and moving points around, and you'll see how that will become critical as we start to think about the pivot point of an object. So let's start with a kind of a really simple little maneuver here. And this is going to be a situation that you're going to face in a lot of your projects, where let's say we've got two different surfaces here. Let's say I've got a box surface here, and I've got a curved surface here. And let's say, for example, that I'm modeling this box, and I want it to be boxy on this side, but I want this side of the cube to sort of hug the edge of the sphere here. Like I want its boxiness to kind of become curvy and sort of conform to the curve of this surface. This is where there's a lot of different ways that we could do this. Obviously, we know from our previous lessons that we can duplicate the faces here on this object, and that will give us a new mesh that we can start from, and then we could extrude that mesh, and we could get something that's boxy that sort of conforms to the surface behind it. So that's one approach. Another approach is going to be, that's not always going to be the best option. It actually happens to be the best option for what we're doing, for what that was. But for this case right here, we're just going to look at how we might take a piece of pre-existing geometry and line it up with another surface. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go into our split view. And I want to do that, and I'm going to change this to an orthographic side view of the object so that we can really look at different strategies for aligning. And in general, when I'm aligning things, it's very often going to be in an orthographic view because it's cleaner. So the first thing that we want to think about when we're aligning things is maybe using the grid. And so we've been using the grid indirectly already. We know, for example, that in our channel box, if we look at any of the units in our channel box here, right, that these units are kind of a function of the grid. So for example, if I translate something 1 unit in Y, it goes up 1 square in Y. If I return it to 0, it goes back down a square in Y. So each one of these little squares on the grid is a unit. And so it's actually a system of measurement that relates to the channel box, right? So, but beyond that, it's also something that you can snap to. Just like in any computer graphics program, the grid is always kind of there for snapping purposes as well. And it's very simple to snap to the grid in Maya. All we've got to do is grab the points that we want to snap, hold down the X key on the keyboard, and snap it. And then all you've got to do is just start moving things around, and you can see that this will very quickly start kind of conforming to the grid. And I can go into one of my other views. I can go into the top view here if I want to sort of stretch that out a little bit more and get that to retain its cubic measurements. And there we go. Right? So we've effectively doubled the size of this cube just by sort of, kind of stretching it out and getting it to meet some other points on the grid. So there's a lot of ways that you can do that. You'll find yourself, maybe especially in the early stages of modeling something, doing that a lot. But let's look at a couple of other potential ways to snap. In particular, the next thing we want to look at is snapping to points. And this is where the grid is I kind of think I use this a bit more than snapping to the grid. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of turn on wireframe over shaded. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to be able to see the geometry that I'm trying to snap this to. And if I can just see the lines there, I know where the intersecting points are, right? And because that's really what we're going to be lining this up with. And then I'm going to kind of bring this a little bit closer to the object. Now, one thing that we need to do to this thing before we can align it to anything is we need to add some geometry to this cube, because in order for the cube to bend and conform to this surface, we need to actually add edge loops. So I'm going to go to my multi-cut tool here and just hold down Control and add an edge loop sort of at every point that this thing needs to bend at. Then I'm going to go into vertex mode. And in vertex mode, I'm going to grab this group of points by marquee selecting that. And now to snap to points, all I need to do is hold down the V key on the keyboard. And again, you can see with snapping, whether I'm holding on X or V, that the center of the move tool changes from a square to a circle. And so that's a good indicator that you've got some kind of snapping enabled. Then I just start moving the object with that on, and you can see immediately that we get kind of a snapping to points. And I've got a nice conforming to the edge of this sphere going on. And then I can just kind of, and you can even do this sort of over a distance, right? So I can actually, it doesn't always work, but in fact, probably not going to work in this case. So let's just manually flatten that out a little bit. There we go. So now you can see that we've got our box here kind of mimicking the shape of the edge of the sphere. And so that is really point alignment. Now you can use this in a lot of different ways. And to bring this all back home to the idea of the pivot point, let's use another example here. And this is where I often use alignment more than anything else. So let's get another cube in the scene here, and then let's make this cube rather large. So I'll do that, and then I'm going to go into my attribute editor here and add some divisions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a ring of these spheres going around the outside edge. So I'll just take a 5 by 5 here. And what I'm doing is I'm creating points for these things to align to, right? So if I've got a nice small sphere here and I turn on wireframe over shaded, everywhere that there's a vertex, I can potentially align this sphere. So if I now go to my 4 views here so that I can see the top as well as the front and the side, I'll be able to do some really quick and easy alignment. So if I grab my sphere here, let's turn on wireframe over shaded in all of my views here just so that I can see that. I can now grab onto my sphere and start to move it and line it up with these points. And so depending, and I can use a combination of views to get that to stick exactly where I want. Now there's a problem here though, right? And that is that the middle of the sphere is kind of aligning with the edge of the cube. And what if we don't want that, right? What if we want the cubes to actually kind of like be just touching the edge and not interpenetrating the geometry? This is where we would actually move the pivot point, right? So if we isolate our sphere for a second here, so let's go into maybe our side view here, and I'm going to hit Control 1 to isolate my sphere. I'm going to move the pivot point on my sphere, and that will allow me to align the pivot point of my sphere to the edge of the box. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hold down the D key so that I can move this pivot point, but then I'm also going to hold down the V key so that I can align the pivot point with the points on the edge of the sphere. And now I have a pivot point that is not in the middle of my sphere, but is exactly at the point on the edge of the sphere. And now I can then hold down the V key again and snap that, and you can see that we've got a sphere that actually is sort of glued to this point on the edge. And now I could just simply Command D to duplicate, hold down the V key, and start moving out my copies. And in no time at all, I will have a nice ring of these spheres going around my edge, right? And that's a very simple, kind of an easy and powerful way to use alignment in Maya. So you can see where this would be pretty effective, right? And not only that, but as we're working on this, right, we can start to think about using our groups to sort of control this with a little bit more power. So for example, right now, this is kind of like not very well organized, right? I've got, actually, it is kind of, these are all put into a nice group. So all these spheres are moving indeed together. But maybe we want to move the cube and the spheres together as one. What we could probably do is I could name this group here. I could just call this spheres. And then I could even name each one of these. So sphere 1, and so on. I won't go through all those. And then I could name this cube. And let's say if I wanted to move these together, all I would need to do is maybe probably rename this spheres and cube. And then grab the cube, middle mouse click and drag, and place it inside spheres and cube. And now I can move these together, right? And if I wanted to change the pivot point of my cube so that it was a little bit more useful than what's here right now, I could always hold down the D key and kind of move it to a different position in space. Or I could simply double click on the move tool and reset the pivot point so that it's at the center of the whole group. So that is alignment, or the basics of alignment and grouping in Maya.